Life under the samurai code. When most people today think of feudal Japan, one image dominates the imagination: the samurai. Tall, armored warriors carrying gleaming katanas, walking with pride and discipline, following a code of honor that demanded loyalty and sacrifice. Modern movies, anime, and video games often romanticize the samurai as noble protectors, defenders of justice, or wise teachers of martial arts. But the reality of life under the samurai class was much harsher, far stricter, and terrifying for the ordinary people who lived beneath their shadow. If you, as a modern person, were suddenly placed in feudal Japan, the samurai code would be the very thing that could end your life within minutes. Bushido, the way of the warrior. The guiding principle of samurai life was Bushido, literally, the way of the warrior. It was not a single written law, but rather a collection of values and expectations that every samurai was expected to live by. These values included loyalty to one's lord, daimyo, above all else, honor in every action, avoiding shame at any cost, discipline in both war and daily life, courage to face death without fear, self-sacrifice for one's master and clan, ruthlessness against enemies, and disobedience. Sounds noble, right? But in practice, this meant the samurai lived in a world where death was preferable to failure. If a samurai was dishonored, even for a small mistake, he was expected to commit seppuku, ritual suicide, by plunging a blade into his own stomach. Now imagine being a farmer or artisan living under such a class of men. These weren't just warriors in battle, they were your overlords in daily life. And they were trained to see disrespect, weakness, or disobedience as crimes worth punishing by death. The right to kill, Kirisute Gomen. One of the most terrifying aspects of samurai power was Kirisute Gomen, the legal right for a samurai to kill a commoner who insulted or disrespected him. This wasn't just about deliberate insults. An insult could mean failing to bow deeply enough when a samurai passed, accidentally brushing against his sleeve on a crowded street, speaking too loudly or too casually in his presence, looking him in the eye for too long. If a samurai felt dishonored, he could cut you down on the spot, and the law would support it. Imagine walking through town as a modern person, used to casual greetings, sarcasm, or even just not paying attention, and suddenly realizing that one wrong move could cost you your life. For anyone who had the misfortune of living there, if you, as a modern person, were suddenly transported back into feudal Japan, chances are you wouldn't last even a single day. Why? Because feudal Japan wasn't built for comfort, equality, or freedom. It was built on rigid hierarchy, strict discipline, constant threats of violence, and survival through sheer endurance. To survive even 24 hours, you would have to abandon every modern luxury you take for granted. Food security, clean water, personal freedom, technology, and even the idea that your life is valuable. A nation in constant turmoil. Feudal Japan, particularly during the Sengoku Jidai, 1467-1603, or Warring States period, was a land drenched in blood. Samurai clans fought endlessly for power, villages were burned down overnight, and civilians lived under the constant threat of invasion or famine. Unlike the modern idea of Japan as a highly organized and peaceful society, this was a world where chaos was the norm. Imagine waking up in your small wooden hut, only to hear that your village might be attacked by rival soldiers by sunset. You could lose everything: your crops, your home, even your family. And there would be no one to protect you. There was no police, no humanitarian aid, no international news to warn you. Survival meant keeping your head low and praying that the fires of war did not reach your doorstep. Even during the Edo period, 1603–1868, which brought more political stability under the Tokugawa shogunate, life was still incredibly restrictive. The shogun's government imposed strict laws and punishments that made daily life suffocating for ordinary people. One wrong word to the wrong person could mean imprisonment, torture, or execution. The rigid social order. The first shock a modern person would face is zero social mobility. In today's world, we believe hard work and talent can move you up the ladder. In feudal Japan, where you were born, determined where you died. The hierarchy looked like this. Emperor, a symbolic figure with little real power. Shogun, the military ruler who truly controlled the country. Daimyo, powerful landowning lords. Samurai, elite warriors loyal to their daimyo. Peasants, farmers and fishermen who made up 80–90% of the population. Artisans, craftsmen who made tools, weapons, and goods. Merchants, considered the lowest class despite their wealth because they didn't produce anything. Outcasts, ida hinin, people who handled impure jobs like butchery, leatherwork, or execution. If you were born a farmer, you would live and die as a farmer. You could not dream of becoming a samurai. If you were born an outcast, you were stuck at the bottom, despised by everyone else. This rigid structure would crush the spirit of any modern person who believes in the right to chase their dream. Diseases and lack of medicine in feudal Japan. When we imagine feudal Japan, many of us think of samurai duels, bustling castles, and rice fields stretching across the countryside. What we don't usually think about is sickness, the silent killer that took more lives than any sword. For a modern person, living even a single day in this world would be terrifying, not just because of war or famine, but because of the near-constant presence of disease, parasites, and the complete lack of modern medicine. The fragile human body in an unforgiving world. In today's world, if you have a fever, you take paracetamol. If you have a bacterial infection, you're given antibiotics. In feudal Japan, however, a simple cut or toothache could spiral into a death sentence. Germ theory didn't exist yet, and most people had no idea how infections spread. They blamed bad air, miasma, spirits, or divine punishment for illness. For peasants, who made up the majority of the population, life was already filled with hunger, exhaustion, and malnutrition. This weakened their immune systems, leaving them vulnerable to outbreaks. Children were especially fragile, and many didn't survive beyond their 5th birthday. Common diseases that ravaged Japan. 1. Smallpox, Hoso do Chuang. Introduced from China and Korea centuries earlier, smallpox was one of the deadliest diseases. Entire villages were wiped out, and survivors were often left with deep scars. Without vaccines, Parents could only pray to protective deities. 2. Tuberculosis, kikaku jiehi, called the disease of consumption because of the way it wasted away the body, spread easily in crowded homes and cities like Edo, where sanitation was poor. With no cure, sufferers coughed blood until they slowly died. 3. Dysentery and cholera, caused by dirty water and bad food storage, common during summer months when heat spoiled food. Villagers often believed spirits in the water caused the sickness. 4. Parasitic worms. With no sewage system, human waste often fertilized crops, spreading parasites. Hookworms, tapeworms, and roundworms lived inside people for years. Chronic fatigue and weakness were common symptoms. No freedom of class. The rigid social pyramid. If there is one thing that would shock any modern person in feudal Japan, it is the absolute lack of freedom when it came to social class. Today, we take it for granted that if we study hard, work with dedication, or take a few risks, we can climb the ladder of society. A poor farmer's son can become a businessman. A student can become a doctor or engineer, and a talented athlete can rise from poverty to fame. But in feudal Japan, your birth decided your destiny, and there was virtually no way to change it. This rigid, unforgiving system, often called the feudal hierarchy, structured society into strict layers, each with privileges, duties, and punishments. Once you were placed in one class, that was where you stayed for life. Breaking these rules wasn't just frowned upon, it could be punished with humiliation, exile, or even death. The Pyramid of Feudal Japan. The structure of society in feudal Japan was deeply influenced by Confucian philosophy and reinforced by the ruling shogunate. It looked something like this. 1. The emperor, seen as a living god, but had little political power, especially after the rise of the shoguns. His role was largely symbolic. 2. The shogun, the real ruler of Japan. As the head of the military government, Bakufu, the shogun had ultimate authority over laws, land, and armies. 3. Daimyo, powerful feudal lords who controlled vast lands. Each daimyo had their own armies of samurai and acted almost like kings within their territories. 4. Samurai, the warrior class, sworn to protect their daimyo. They enjoyed high status, carried swords, and followed the strict code of Bushido, the way of the warrior. 5. Peasants, farmers, the backbone of the nation. Though poor, they were considered more honorable than merchants because they produced food, which was essential. 6. Artisans, craftsmen, skilled workers like carpenters, swordsmiths, potters, and weavers. They provided necessary goods, but ranked below farmers in status. 7. Merchants. At the very bottom of society, among the common classes, merchants were despised because they did not produce anything, only bought and sold goods. Ironically, many became wealthy, but were still treated with disdain. 8. Outcasts, eta hinin. Those who dealt with impure tasks such as tanning leather, butchery, handling corpses, or serving as executioners. They were shunned, segregated, and lived on the fringes of society. 9. Non-humans, barakumin. At the very bottom, they were treated worse than animals and excluded from normal society. This ladder was fixed and enforced by law. Crossing boundaries was not just socially difficult, it was legally forbidden. No escape from birth. Imagine being born the child of a poor rice farmer. That means You would work in muddy fields from dawn until dusk. You would hand over most of your harvest as tax to the daimyo. You would live in a small hut with barely enough food. You would die a farmer, no matter how smart, brave, or hardworking you were. There was no chance of becoming a samurai, a merchant, or even a craftsman unless you were born into that class. Social climbing was almost impossible. For modern people, raised on stories of self-made billionaires, freedom to change careers, and the dream of upward mobility, this system would feel like a cage. The privileges of the samurai. The samurai were the most feared and respected class below the daimyo. They lived by bushido and were allowed to carry two swords, the katana, long sword, and wakizashi, short sword. But their privilege wasn't just symbolic. A samurai had the legal right to kill anyone from the lower classes who disrespected him, even for something as small as failing to bow properly. This law, known as kiri sute gomen, the right to strike down, meant that ordinary people lived in constant fear. If you, as a modern traveler, accidentally looked a samurai in the eye, bumped into him on a crowded street, or failed to bow deeply enough, you might be cut down on the spot. Merchants, rich but powerless. One of the strangest parts of this hierarchy was the treatment of merchants. In modern times, wealth often equals respect, but in feudal Japan, merchants were despised. Why? Because Confucian values placed honor on production, like farming or crafting, not on profit. So even if a merchant became rich selling rice, silk, or sake, he would still rank lower than a poor farmer. Merchants could not wear luxurious clothes openly, and many were forced to lend money secretly to samurai or daimyo, who often looked down on them despite borrowing heavily. Imagine being a successful businessman, but being treated like dirt by everyone above you. For a modern capitalist, this would be unbearable. Outcasts, the unseen people. At the very bottom were the Ita, polluted ones, and Hainen, non-people. The Ita handled death-related jobs like butchery, tanning hides, or executing criminals. The Hainen were beggars, entertainers, and those considered criminal or impure. They lived in separate villages, couldn't enter certain temples, and were forbidden from marrying outside their group. To be born an outcast was to be sentenced to a life of shame. For someone from today's world, where we talk about equality, human rights, and dignity, this level of institutionalized discrimination would be shocking. Punishments for breaking the rules. Trying to rise above your class wasn't just discouraged, it was punished harshly. If a farmer pretended to be a samurai, wore a sword illegally, or failed to show respect to his social superiors, the punishment could include public humiliation, flogging, loss of land, execution. Even speaking against the system was dangerous. The Tokugawa shogunate had spies everywhere, and rebellion against social order was crushed ruthlessly. The psychological weight of the pyramid. Living in such a rigid system wasn't just physically limiting, it was mentally crushing. People grew up knowing they would never escape their birth. Dreams were stifled before they even began. A farmer's son could dream of being a warrior, but he knew it was impossible. A merchant's daughter could marry into wealth, but she could never gain respect. An outcast child could work harder than anyone, but he would still be shunned. This lack of mobility created a society where obedience and acceptance were the only survival strategies. For modern individuals raised to chase your dreams and be anything you want to be, feudal Japan would feel like an endless prison. Why you wouldn't last a day if you, as a modern person, were loyalty above life. The loyalty demanded by Bushido wasn't just about respect. It was absolute. Samurai were expected to serve their daimyo with unquestioning obedience. If their lord ordered them to fight, they fought. If he ordered them to die, they died. For example, during times of war, a samurai might be told to lead his men into a hopeless battle simply to delay the enemy. Retreat was not an option. Surrender was considered shameful. The only honorable outcome was to die in battle. This same loyalty extended downward. Peasants, under a daimyo's rule, were expected to serve the samurai with the same obedience. If you failed to deliver rice taxes, refused to work, or complained about your treatment, the punishment could be brutal. In many cases, whole villages were burned as warnings to others. Seppuku, death before dishonor. To the samurai, death was preferable to shame. This was why the ritual of seppuku, harakiri, existed. If a samurai failed his master, was captured in battle, or dishonored himself in any way, he was expected to take his short sword, wakizashi, and disembowel himself in front of witnesses. This act was considered the only way to cleanse his name and show his loyalty, even in death. Sometimes, an assistant, kaishakunin, would mercifully behead him after the initial cut to shorten the suffering. Now imagine you, as a modern worker, being told that if you miss a deadline, make a mistake at your job, or lose a sports match, your honorable choice would be to kill yourself in front of everyone. This shows how alien and terrifying the samurai code would be to modern sensibilities. Violence as everyday reality. For ordinary people, samurai violence wasn't rare. It was a constant threat. Samurai duels could break out in the street. Peasants could be punished harshly for small infractions, and warlords often ordered executions to maintain discipline. Even during the supposedly peaceful Edo period, the samurai class still carried swords and trained daily in martial arts. This meant that commoners lived in the shadow of a warrior class that valued death, honor, and obedience above compassion. Imagine walking through your neighborhood today, except every police officer, soldier, and politician was allowed to execute you for something as simple as failing to show respect. That was the daily reality of living under the samurai code. Women and the samurai code. For women in samurai families, life was equally harsh. Samurai women were expected to uphold the honor of their household. They were trained in nagitana, a type of pole weapon, to defend their homes, but they were also expected to kill themselves if captured by enemies to preserve their family's honor. Marriage was often political, with women used as bargaining tools between clans. Their duty was loyalty to their husband, obedience to his family, and the defense of his reputation at all costs. For modern women, who value personal choice, independence, and equality, this role would feel suffocating and terrifying. The psychological prison of Bushido. The code of Bushido wasn't just about behavior. It shaped the entire psychology of society. Samurai had to constantly live with the awareness that one wrong move could lead to dishonor and death. Commoners lived with the knowledge that a samurai's anger could mean instant punishment. This created a world ruled not by compassion, but by fear, discipline, and ritualized violence. To survive in such a society, you had to suppress your individuality and live in constant caution. Why you wouldn't last a day. As a modern person, life under the samurai code would break you almost immediately. You're used to casual speech, but here, one wrong word could get you killed. You're used to complaining when treated unfairly, but here, protest could be seen as dishonor. You're used to seeing law as protection, but here, law protected the samurai, not you. Backbreaking
used to the
farmer's
idea.
life. When people think of feudal Japan, the first image is often of samurai and warlords clashing with swords and banners waving in the wind. But the truth is, samurai were only a tiny fraction of the population. The real backbone of the country was made up of peasants and farmers who formed nearly 80–90% of society. Without their endless labor in the rice paddies, fishing villages, and farmlands, the grand castles and mighty armies would have collapsed in an instant. Yet, despite being the foundation of the nation, peasants lived some of the hardest, most unforgiving lives imaginable. If you were suddenly dropped into the shoes of a feudal Japanese farmer, it would not be romantic or peaceful. It would be endless toil, hunger, and suffering. Rice, the currency of survival. In feudal Japan, rice was life. It wasn't just food. It was currency, tax, and power, all rolled into one. Samurai and daimyo measured their wealth not in coins, but in koku, the amount of rice needed to feed one person for a year. A daimyo's prestige came from how many koku of rice his land could produce. But here's the bitter truth. Peasants grew the rice, yet they rarely ate it. Most of the harvest was seized as tax by the daimyo or his samurai retainers. A farmer's family might work every day of the year planting, tending, and harvesting rice, only to hand over the majority of it to their lord. What remained for them was usually millet, barley, or wild vegetables, far less nourishing than rice. For a modern person used to eating 3 balanced meals, this would feel like robbery. You would work endlessly in the mud only to hand over the very food you grew, living in constant hunger while the elite feasted. Taxes that crushed peasants in feudal Japan faced backbreaking taxation. In some domains, as much as 40–60% of their harvest went directly to the daimyo. This wasn't optional. Samurai tax collectors would arrive at harvest season to measure and confiscate rice. Failure to meet the quota could mean severe punishment, confiscation of your land, flogging or imprisonment, burning of your home. In extreme cases, execution, and remember, natural disasters were common. A bad flood, a typhoon, or an insect plague could destroy crops. But even then, taxes had to be paid. If you couldn't deliver rice, your family might starve and face punishment. Imagine being forced to pay taxes to your government, even when your paycheck disappears, and being beaten if you can't. That was daily reality for farmers. Dawn to dusk. Labor farming in Japan was not mechanized. There were no tractors, no modern tools, and no chemical fertilizers. Every stage of rice farming, planting, weeding, irrigating, harvesting, was done by hand, with the help of simple wooden or iron tools. A farmer's day started before dawn. Men plowed the muddy paddies with oxen. Women transplanted seedlings by hand, often knee-deep in water. Children scared away birds or carried bundles. During harvest, the entire village worked together under constant supervision. Hunger and famine. There was no such thing as a day off. One of the harshest realities of farmer life was rare breaks, but otherwise, since most rice was taken by the daimyo, 65-day responsibility, peasants often survived on thin gruel. For a modern worker used to weekends, holidays, and 8-hour shifts, meat lifestyle would feel like fish was only available in coastal areas. Famines were frequent and devastating. In some years, entire regions starved because of crop failure. Desperate peasants resorted to eating bark, roots, or mud cakes. There are even records of cannibalism during extreme famines. In modern times, if your harvest fails, you can buy food at a store. In feudal Japan, if your harvest failed, you and your children simply starved. Life in a peasant village. Peasants lived in small wooden houses with thatched roofs, usually one room shared by the whole family. These homes had little protection from rain or cold, and winters were brutal. Fires were fueled by wood. but peasants often had to save fuel, leaving them shivering in the cold. Villages were tightly controlled communities. Elders and village heads made sure everyone worked and paid taxes. The daimyo's samurai would occasionally visit to enforce rules and maintain order. Privacy didn't exist, and neither did freedom of movement. Peasants couldn't leave their villages without permission. For a modern person used to private homes, electricity, running water, and the freedom to travel, this would feel suffocating. Fear of samurai. The farmer's hardest burden wasn't just work or hunger. It was living under the constant fear of samurai. Peasants were forbidden to carry swords or weapons. If a farmer ever showed defiance or disrespect to a samurai, the punishment could be death under kirisut gomen, the right to cut down. Villages could be punished collectively if someone disobeyed. In other words, farmers were at the absolute mercy of warriors who valued honor above life. Imagine working all day in the fields and then being beaten or even killed because a passing samurai thought you didn't bow deeply enough. Women and children in the fields. Farming was a family effort. Women worked alongside men, planting rice seedlings and weeding fields. They also carried water, prepared food, and wove cloth during the off-season. There was no rest for mothers. Childbirth was often followed by a return to the fields within days. Children weren't spared either. Even small children were given jobs like scaring crows, carrying bundles, or tending to animals. Education was minimal. Survival skills were all that mattered. Compared to today's childhood, with schools, games, and protection from labor, peasant children lived hard, joyless lives. Punishment and rebellion. Farmers sometimes rebelled against crushing taxes and starvation, but uprisings were almost always crushed violently. Samurai armies would burn villages, kill leaders, and enforce even stricter rules afterward. Rebellion wasn't bravery. It was usually suicide. For most peasants, the only survival strategy was obedience, submission, and silence. Why you wouldn't last a day. For a modern person, being thrown into the life of a feudal Japanese farmer would be unbearable. You would collapse from the endless dawn to dusk labor in muddy rice fields. You would rage at handing over your food as tax, while your family went hungry. You would feel suffocated by the lack of freedom. No movement, no privacy, no choice. You would tremble under the threat of samurai punishment. You would despair in famine, knowing there was no safety net, no store, no government aid. Farmers were the lifeblood of Japan, but they lived on the edge of survival every single day. For anyone used to modern comfort and freedom, lasting even one day in their sandals would feel like enduring a lifetime of suffering. Why you wouldn't last a day. Final analysis. After journeying through the brutal, unforgiving, and often terrifying realities of feudal Japan, it becomes clear why modern people, accustomed to comfort, rights, technology, and convenience, would hardly last a single day in that era. The crushing weight of class. In feudal Japan, you were not free to dream, explore, or rise above your station. Birth dictated everything. If you were born a peasant, you lived and died a peasant. The samurai lorded over you with unquestionable authority, and any sign of defiance could cost you your life. Today's individualism and social mobility simply did not exist. A modern person, used to freedom of choice, would feel suffocated within hours. The harsh environment of survival food. Shortages, famines, and harsh climates left most peasants hungry more often than full. Modern people who complain when Wi-Fi lags or a supermarket is closed would collapse under the daily uncertainty of whether there would be food tomorrow. Disease without medicine was rampant. Parasites lived in your body, and natural disasters could erase entire villages overnight. Violence as a constant companion. Whether from warlords, bandits, samurai punishments, or even your own community enforcing rules, violence was everywhere. Life was cheap, and death could come suddenly without justice or trial. Today's world, even with its flaws, values law and order far more. A modern traveler, used to calling police or expecting rights, would not survive the swift brutality of feudal justice, the silence of rights and freedoms. No human rights, no freedom of speech, no democracy. Women had little say, peasants had none, and even samurai were bound by the iron code of Bushido. There was no space for rebellion, and no sympathy for those who questioned authority. A modern person who values freedom would be seen as a dangerous rebel. Hygiene, medicine, and comfort, non-existent. No running water, no soap as we know it, no hospitals, no antibiotics, no privacy. A single cut could lead to deadly infection. Cities stank, homes were fragile, winters were freezing, summers were humid. Anyone raised in modern conditions of electricity, plumbing, and air conditioning would find it nearly impossible to tolerate. A world ruled by fear and faith superstition, yokai stories and strict religious controls shaped everyday life. Fear wasn't just from lords and samurai. It was also spiritual. A sneeze, an omen, a dream. Any could dictate decisions. For rational modern minds, this would feel maddening. The final verdict. All these realities combined make one truth crystal clear. Feudal Japan was not a place of romance, honor, or samurai glory, as movies often suggest. It was a world of hardship, inequality, violence, and relentless struggle for survival. While the people of that time endured it because they were born into it, modern individuals, shaped by comfort, freedom, and technology, would break under the weight of feudal life in mere hours. You wouldn't last a day
Leprosy,
in feudal Japan, Hansen's disease, because you were never built to. People with disfiguring symptoms were cast out of society. Considered cursed, they were forced to live in isolated communities. Medicine was more superstition than science. Feudal Japan did have doctors known as kusushi, yaoshi, but their remedies were limited. Medicine came from a mix of Chinese herbal traditions, Shinto purification rituals, and Buddhist prayers. Some treatments helped a little, but many were based on trial and error. Herbal remedies. Plants like ginseng, licorice root, and ginger were commonly used. Acupuncture moxibustion. Borrowed from Chinese medicine, needles and burning herbs were used to balance the body's energy. Superstitions, talismans, chanting sutras, and offerings to gods were believed to drive away illness-causing spirits. While these practices may have provided comfort, they rarely cured serious diseases. The role of religion in healing religion was deeply tied to health. Temples often served as centers of healing, where monks performed rituals for the sick. Some people would walk for days to shrines dedicated to healing deities. For smallpox, parents dressed their sick children in red robes, believing the color would ward off the illness. But despite faith and rituals, death rates remained high. The average person in feudal Japan could expect to live only 30 to 40 years, much lower than today's global average. Why modern people wouldn't survive? Imagine this. You wake up with a high fever and stomach pain. In the modern world, you'd visit a doctor, get antibiotics, and recover in days. In feudal Japan, you'd probably be told to drink a bitter herbal tea, pray at a shrine, and hope the gods spared you. Chances are you wouldn't make it through the week. The constant threat of disease shaped how people lived. Families expected to lose children to illness. Villagers accepted epidemics as part of life, and the lack of understanding about hygiene meant that outbreaks spread again and again. Conclusion: diseases were the invisible enemies of feudal Japan. Unlike wars or famines, they could strike at any moment, killing young and old alike. With no modern medicine, no hospitals, and only faith to cling to, survival was more a matter of luck than strength. For a modern person used to vaccines, antibiotics, and clean hospitals, a single fever or infection in feudal Japan would almost certainly be fatal. And that's why brutal punishments and execution methods in feudal Japan. When we think of feudal Japan, many imagine graceful samurai, peaceful cherry blossoms, and elegant castles. But behind that romantic image was a society with one of the harshest justice systems in history. If you lived in feudal Japan, one wrong step, whether insulting a samurai, failing to pay your rice tax, or even breaking minor rules, could mean torture, dismemberment, or a public execution meant to terrify others into obedience. For a modern person used to human rights and fair trials, surviving this system would be nearly impossible. Justice without mercy. The justice system of feudal Japan was built on one principle: fear keeps people obedient. Unlike today's world of courts, lawyers, and evidence, your fate often depended on your social class and the mood of the local authority. A samurai's word carried more weight than any peasant's, and the punishment was always harsher for commoners. Trials were often symbolic. Decisions had been made before you even spoke. For example, under the Tokugawa shogunate, 1603-1868, the government believed harsh laws maintained order. Crimes were categorized as serious, capital offenses, and lesser, punishable by whipping, fines, or exile. But the line between them was razor thin. A poor farmer stealing rice could be punished as severely as a murderer because food shortages threatened the entire social system. Everyday offenses that could kill you. In feudal Japan, punishments weren't reserved for heinous crimes. Here are examples of offenses that could lead to brutal consequences. Insulting a samurai. Instant execution, often by beheading. Failing to pay rice tax, confiscation of land, family starvation, or crucifixion. Practicing Christianity during Sakoku isolation, torture and death by fire. Disobeying class laws, merchants dressing like nobles, peasants owning swords, public humiliation or worse. Arson or theft, crucifixion, boiling alive, or burning at the stake. What shocks modern minds is how collective punishment worked. If one person in your village committed a crime, the whole group could suffer, since authorities saw community responsibility as a way to keep people policing each other. Methods of execution and punishment. Life in feudal Japan came with some of the cruelest punishments ever documented. The goal wasn't just to kill criminals, it was to make their deaths so terrifying that others would never dare to repeat the crime. 1. Seppuku, ritual suicide. Reserved for samurai, this was considered an honorable punishment. The condemned man had to stab himself in the abdomen with a short sword, cutting across his belly, often while another warrior, the kaishakunin, stood ready to behead him. While seen as burning alive, arson was considered a catastrophic crime, especially in wooden cities like Edo. Offenders were burned alive in public squares as a warning. 4. Boiling or steaming. Some criminals were punished by being boiled in hot water or oil. In certain provinces, a large iron cauldron was used, and the condemned were slowly lowered in. 5. Sawing and dismemberment. Particularly brutal crimes like rebellion or treason could lead to being cut into pieces. Limbs were sometimes displayed in public places. 6. Exile or hard labor. Not all punishments meant instant death. Some criminals were banished to remote islands or sentenced to labor in mines where conditions were so horrific that death was certain within months. Public spectacle of death. Executions in feudal Japan were community events. Instead of hiding death behind prison walls as we do today, authorities showcased it. Families, villagers, even children were forced to watch. This wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was psychological control. The sight of burning bodies or crucifixion convinced ordinary peasants that obedience was the only path to survival. The infamous Suzugamori execution grounds in Edo became one of the largest sites for public killings, where thousands of people were executed between the 1600s and 1800s. For locals, it was both terrifying and strangely normalized, like a grim festival of fear. Torture before execution. In many cases, criminals endured torture before their death. This wasn't about extracting information. It was about prolonging fear and setting an example. Methods included hojojutsu, binding with rope so tightly it cut into flesh, hanging upside down over pits, sometimes with spikes, beatings with bamboo rods, water torture by forced drowning and reviving repeatedly. For peasants and lower classes, even being suspected of crime could mean a torturous death without proof. Why you wouldn't survive it. For a modern person, raised with rights like innocent until proven guilty, the brutality of feudal Japan's punishments would be unthinkable. Imagine living in fear that a small mistake, stepping out of line, speaking the wrong word, or simply offending a higher class citizen could mean public torture and death. There was no legal safety net, no appeal process, no lawyers to defend you. Justice was about control, not fairness. The sheer randomness and severity of punishments would break the spirit of most modern people within days. Lessons from the harshness. While terrifying, these punishments kept society rigidly ordered. The Tokugawa period, 1603-1868, is sometimes called the Great Peace, but it was peace maintained by fear and blood. Few dared to rebel, and crime was suppressed not because people were moral, but because they were afraid of punishment worse than death. The lesson is sobering. Order without compassion may achieve stability, but at the cost of humanity. Feudal Japan teaches us that fear builds food obedience, scarcity, and harsh diet. Freedom needs justice. When people today imagine Japanese food, they often think of sushi, steaming bowls of ramen, or beautifully arranged bento boxes. But in feudal Japan, the diet of the majority of the population looked nothing like this. For the commoner, food scarcity was a constant shadow. Starvation and malnutrition were everyday realities, and the diet of peasants and even lower-ranked samurai was far harsher than most modern people could ever endure. In fact, your body, conditioned by modern supermarkets and fast food chains, would likely fail to adapt. Let's step into the kitchens and fields of feudal Japan and see why you wouldn't last a day. Rice wasn't for everyone. Rice was the foundation of Japan's economy. Taxes were not paid in coins, but in koku of rice, a unit representing the amount of rice needed to feed one person for a year. Daimyo, lords, and samurai wealth was measured in rice, not in gold. But here's the twist. Although rice symbolized wealth, the common farmer who grew it rarely ate much of it. Instead, peasants were expected to hand over large portions of their harvest as taxes. What remained for them was often meager. For daily meals, they relied heavily on millet, barley, and other grains, which were cheaper and easier to produce, but far less filling or nutritious compared to polished white rice. A farmer might get only a few small bowls of rice in a week, while their samurai overlords dined on it daily. Imagine working sunup to sundown in the rice fields, but barely tasting the crop you harvested. That was the cruel irony of feudal Japan. Starvation. During famines. Japan's geography and climate made it extremely vulnerable to famines. Heavy rains, floods, or harsh winters could wipe out crops. Famines like the Kyoho famine, 1732-1733, or the Tenmei famine, 1782-1788, killed hundreds of thousands of people. During these famines, desperate peasants resorted to survival foods, wild plants, tree bark, and even eating mud mixed with straw to trick their stomachs into feeling full. People weakened by malnutrition were more vulnerable to disease, and many starved quietly in their villages, while the samurai elite ensured their own food supplies were secure. If you were transported back to this time, accustomed to 3 balanced meals a day, your body would struggle to cope with the intense calorie deficit. The lack of protein, fat, and vitamins would quickly lead to exhaustion, illness, and potentially death. Salt, fish, and preservation. Japan's island geography did provide fish, but access was not equal. Coastal villagers could fish daily, while inland peasants relied on dried or fermented fish, luxuries for the poor. Salt was expensive, and preserving food was difficult without refrigeration. Common preservation techniques included fermentation, such as miso, fermented soybean paste, or soy sauce, both essential for flavor. Drying. Fish and seaweed were sun-dried for long storage. Pickling. Vegetables were pickled in salt or rice bran, but these preserved foods were often salty, sour, and lacking in freshness. For peasants, the taste of daily meals was monotonous. Meat was forbidden, officially. Nutritional diversity was minimal. For centuries, Buddhism heavily influenced Japanese diets. Eating 4-legged animals like cows, pigs, or horses was taboo and even banned by imperial decree. Chickens were sometimes eaten, but mostly for their eggs. The average person's protein came from fish, tofu, and soybeans. Samurai and wealthy classes occasionally broke these rules in secret, eating wild game like boar or deer, but the common people had little access to meat. Compared to the protein-rich diets of modern society, the average feudal Japanese diet was severely lacking in calories and muscle-building nutrients. Imagine a modern gym-goer or athlete trying to train on nothing but millet porridge, pickled radish, and miso soup. They wouldn't last a week, let alone a lifetime. The daily meal, ichiju isai. The standard daily meal for peasants was called ichiju isai, 1 soup, 1 side dish. This usually included a bowl of barley or millet mixed with a little rice, if lucky. Miso soup with vegetables, pickles, or boiled greens. For wealthier classes, it might be ichiju sansai, 1 soup and 3 side dishes including fish, tofu, or seasonal vegetables. But for peasants, the portions were small, the flavors repetitive, and the nutrition barely sufficient. Modern people, accustomed to variety, snacks, desserts, and coffee breaks, would be shocked by the plainness and scarcity of meals. There were no sugary treats for energy, no caffeine for alertness, and no easy snacks to grab on the go. Alcohol for escape's sake, rice wine, was one indulgence across all classes, though the quality varied drastically. For peasants, it was weak and watery, but it provided an escape from hunger and hardship. Drunkenness was sometimes the only way to forget an empty stomach. The contrast with samurai and daimyo feasts. While peasants struggled with millet and miso, the samurai and daimyo classes enjoyed lavish banquets. Their meals could include rice, fresh fish, seasonal delicacies, sake, and elaborate dishes prepared with artistic presentation. Banquets were not just about eating, but about demonstrating power and wealth. This stark contrast made famine and hunger all the more bitter for peasants. They could see abundance just beyond their reach, yet were forbidden by duty and hierarchy from sharing in it. Why you wouldn't survive? For a modern person, the diet of feudal Japan would be unbearable. Low calories would leave you weak and dizzy. Nutrient deficiencies would cause illness, scurvy, rickets, anemia. Monotony of meals would break your spirit. Famine conditions could push you into starvation. In truth, only those born into this harsh reality could survive it. Their bodies were adapted, their expectations minimal, and their survival instincts sharp. For you, one day without modern convenience foods, snacks, and supplements would feel like torture. A week might strict rules, little autonomy, and lives that revolved around serving men, whether fathers, husbands, or masters. Let's explore why gender inequality in feudal Japan was so severe, and why modern women, and even men who respect gender equality, would find it nearly impossible to survive. The role of women in the samurai class. At the top of society, samurai women may appear privileged compared to peasant women, but their lives were just as controlled. A samurai woman's role was defined by loyalty and obedience. She was expected to serve her husband faithfully, raise children, and preserve the honor of the household. Love was rarely considered in marriage. Alliances were arranged to strengthen family ties. For example, a samurai wife could be divorced if she failed to produce a son. Husbands could take mistresses without shame, but a woman accused of infidelity risked death. Widows were often pressured not to remarry, as their sole duty was to guard the family legacy. Some women were trained in martial arts, carrying naginata, pole weapons, to defend the household if their husbands were at war. While this gave them a rare sense of empowerment, it did not translate to social equality. Their worth was still judged by their ability to serve male honor. The harsh reality of peasant women. If samurai women had restricted freedoms, peasants had almost none. The majority of women in feudal Japan were born into farming families, where survival depended on relentless physical labor. Workload. Women were expected to work in the fields from sunrise to sunset, in addition to raising children, cooking, weaving, and maintaining the household. Childbearing. With high infant mortality rates, women often gave birth to many children in hopes that a few would survive. Death during childbirth was common. Obedience. A woman's duty was first to her father, then to her husband, and finally to her son. She had no say in her own future. If her husband failed to pay taxes, women and children suffered equally. Famine often forced mothers to make heartbreaking sacrifices, sometimes eating less, so their children could survive. For modern women used to education, careers, and independence, this lack of choice would feel suffocating. The world of geisha and courtesans. When people hear about women in Japanese history, geisha often come to mind. But it's important to understand that geisha were not free women, nor were they equivalent to the glamorous entertainers we sometimes see in movies. Geisha, skilled in music, dance, and conversation, geisha entertained wealthy men. However, most were sold into the profession as children by poor families. Training was brutal, and debts to their house kept them bound for years. Courtesans, oiran. These women worked in the licensed red light districts. While they could wield temporary influence over powerful men, their lives were dictated by brothel owners and clients. Disease, abuse, and early death were common. Though they held cultural importance, these women had little control over their own lives. A modern person imagining glamour would instead face harsh exploitation. Marriage and divorce. Marriage in feudal Japan was rarely about love. Instead, it was a contract between families. Arranged marriages. Families negotiated alliances, often ignoring the wishes of the bride. Dowries. Women brought wealth into the marriage, but once married, all property belonged to the husband. Divorce. Men could issue a simple letter of divorce, mikudori-han, while women had almost no recourse. Abandonment left many women destitute. The legal system heavily favored men. Even in the rare case of a woman initiating divorce, she risked social shame and poverty. Women and education. For most of feudal history, women's education was considered unnecessary. Samurai women might learn to read and write to manage household accounts or read moral texts, but peasants had no such opportunities. Instead, girls were taught obedience, modesty, and domestic skills. A popular instructional text, Onna Daigaku, the Greater Learning for Women, advised, "A woman must obey her father, husband, and later her son. A woman should never be jealous or complain. A woman's duty was to bear sons and manage the home." This philosophy left women with little chance to dream beyond domestic life. Compared to today's emphasis on personal growth and education, it would feel like a prison. The double standards of morality. Feudal Japan was full of moral double standards. Men could visit courtesans without shame. Women had to remain pure. Men could remarry easily. Women faced stigma if divorced. Men could inherit property and land. Women had no such rights. Even women of the ruling samurai class often became pawns in political marriages. Their value was measured by their usefulness to men. Rare exceptions, women of power. Despite the harsh norms, a few women stood out in history. Figures like Tomoe Gozen, a legendary female warrior, and Hojo Masako, the nun shogun, who ruled after her husband's death, showed that women could wield authority. But these examples were rare exceptions, not the norm. Most women remained invisible in the historical record, living and dying in obscurity. Why you wouldn't last a day. If you're a modern woman, your rights to education, independence, and self-expression would vanish overnight in feudal Japan. If you're a modern man who values equality, you would struggle to watch the women in your life reduced to silence and servitude. Life in feudal Japan for women was not just hard, it was suffocating. Every breath, every choice, every relationship was controlled by the weight of patriarchy. This is why you, with your modern expectations of freedom and fairness, wouldn't last a day in that world. Child life in feudal Japan. Growing up in hardship. When we imagine childhood today, we think of school, toys, cartoons, and carefree playtime. But if you were born in feudal Japan, childhood was anything but easy. Children were seen not as individuals with rights, but as extensions of their family's duty, class, and survival. From the moment you were born, your life was already mapped out, whether you would grow up to till the fields, train with a sword, or serve your clan until death. For modern people used to comfort and freedom, growing up as a child in feudal Japan would feel like an endless struggle. Birth was not a guarantee of survival. Life for a child in feudal Japan began with a gamble. Infant mortality rates were incredibly high due to poor hygiene, lack of medical knowledge, and frequent outbreaks of diseases like smallpox, measles, or even simple infections. It wasn't unusual for families to lose multiple children in infancy. Parents sometimes waited years before officially registering a child in temple records, because until then, they weren't sure if the baby would survive. for a modern person who expects safe hospitals, vaccinations, and doctors, being born in a feudal Japanese hut with no sterile equipment would already be a life or death ordeal. Childhood was not playtime. Unlike today, children in feudal Japan weren't given years of carefree play. From as early as age 5 or 6, they were expected to help with household or farm work. A peasant child might spend long days in the rice paddies, carrying water, planting seedlings, or chasing away birds that threatened the crops. Wealthier children, like the sons of samurai, had different responsibilities, but their lives weren't easier. They were drilled in strict discipline, taught martial arts, swordsmanship, and the values of Bushido, honor, loyalty, courage. Play was rare, and childhood was seen less as a time of innocence and more as preparation for the hard realities of adult life. Education meant duty, not freedom. Education varied depending on your social class. Samurai children. Boys were trained in reading, writing, and Confucian teachings. They also learned archery, sword fighting, horseback riding, and the art of war. Girls were taught to manage a household, sew, and sometimes use small weapons to protect the home. Peasant children. Most had no formal education. They learned farming skills, religious rituals, and obedience. Their school was the field. Merchant and artisan children. Learned family trades from a young age. A boy whose father was a carpenter, for example, would begin learning woodworking as soon as he was strong enough to hold tools. For modern kids who complain about schoolwork, the rigid and lifelong apprenticeship of feudal Japan would feel unbearable. Discipline was harsh. Children were expected to obey their parents and elders without question. Disobedience was punished severely, sometimes with beatings, sometimes with humiliation. Samurai children in particular were trained never to show fear or weakness. If they cried or resisted, they could be scolded, punished, or even struck by their teachers. Imagine a modern child who throws tantrums at bedtime or refuses to do chores. In feudal Japan, such behavior would have been met with harsh consequences. Childhood was about discipline, not self-expression. Child marriage and early responsibility. By the time a child entered their early teens, they were already seen as adults. For girls, this could mean being married off as young as 13 or 14, sometimes even younger, to secure alliances or strengthen family ties. Boys of samurai families were often sent to serve a lord as pages, where they learned discipline and loyalty. In short, there was no teenage period as we think of it today. A child of 12 might already be managing a household or preparing to fight in battle. Samurai children, raised for war. If you were the son of a samurai, your life was especially tough. Training began almost as soon as you could walk. By the age of 5 or 6, you were expected to know how to handle basic weapons. At 10, you might start real martial arts training. By 15, you were considered ready to join your father in service. You were taught never to dishonor your family name. Stories of young samurai committing seppuku, ritual suicide, rather than face shame, were used as lessons for boys, even when they were very young. Imagine being told at 10 years old that it was better to die than to bring shame to your clan. An idea completely unthinkable for a modern child. Girls' childhoods were different, but not easier. For daughters, life wasn't softer. From childhood, girls were trained to obey their fathers, then their husbands. They learned skills like sewing, cooking, and managing a household. Noble daughters might be taught poetry, calligraphy, and music. But their ultimate purpose was to be married into another family for political or social advantage. Some samurai daughters were trained to use the naginata, a type of pole weapon, so they could defend their household in case of attack. But this was rare. For most girls, their childhood was simply preparation for domestic life. Religion and childhood rituals. Despite the hardships, children did have some moments of cultural celebration. Festivals like Shichi-go-san, celebrating children aged 3, 5, and 7, existed even in feudal times, where families prayed for health and longevity. Buddhist and Shinto rituals marked milestones, and children were taught to respect the spirits, ancestors, and deities that guided life. But even these rituals reflected the fragility of life. They were less about fun and more about asking for survival in a dangerous world. Why you wouldn't last a day as a child in feudal Japan. For a modern person, growing up in feudal Japan would be unthinkable. No cartoons, no schools with free choice, no teenage years of self-discovery. Instead, your childhood would be filled with labor, discipline, fear of disease, and strict obedience. By the time you reach the age when modern children are just starting high school, you would already be married, farming, or fighting. In feudal Japan, childhood wasn't a time to dream. It was a time to survive. Foreigners were not welcome. Imagine stepping into feudal Japan as a foreigner. The first thing you would realize is that you are not welcome. Unlike today, where Japan attracts millions of tourists every year with its blend of tradition and modernity, the Japan of the Edo period, 1603-1868, was a nation that closed its doors tightly to the outside world. If you were a foreigner, survival wasn't just difficult, it was nearly impossible. The policy of sakoku, suogo, meaning locked country, ensured that outsiders could not freely enter Japan, and even if they did, the consequences were usually imprisonment, execution, or exile. Let's explore why life as a foreigner in feudal Japan would have been so harsh, and why you wouldn't last a day in such an environment. The isolation policy. Sakoku under the Tokugawa shogunate. Japan adopted the sakoku policy beginning in the 1630s. The reason? The shogunate feared the growing influence of Europeans, especially Portuguese traders and Christian missionaries, who were rapidly spreading religion and foreign ideas. The rulers believed that Christianity threatened the stability of Japanese society and the authority of the shogun. As a result, Japan essentially cut itself off from the outside world. Only a handful of Chinese and Dutch merchants were allowed to trade at designated ports such as Nagasaki's tiny artificial island of Dejima. Even they were strictly monitored, confined to their quarters, and forbidden from spreading their culture or religion. For an average foreigner, entering Japan without authorization meant certain death. Unlike today, where visas and passports regulate travel, feudal Japan's system was based on suspicion and hostility. Outsiders were seen as potential spies or invaders. Christianity and persecution. One of the most brutal reasons foreigners were unwelcome was the fear of Christianity. European missionaries, particularly from Portugal and Spain, had converted thousands of Japanese to Christianity during the 16th century. At first, local lords welcomed this because it brought trade connections, guns, and new technology. But soon, the shogunate realized that Christianity was eroding loyalty to Japanese rulers. The reaction was swift and merciless. The Tokugawa regime outlawed Christianity, and anyone caught practicing it was severely punished. Foreign missionaries were executed, and Japanese converts were forced to renounce their faith. Some were tortured in public as warnings. For a foreigner, simply being suspected of spreading Christianity was enough to end your life. The infamous fumi practice required suspected Christians to step on images of Jesus or Mary Refusal meant torture and death. A foreigner wandering into Japan during this time would immediately fall under suspicion. Strict control over trade. Even trade was tightly regulated. The Dutch, who were allowed to stay, had to accept humiliating restrictions. They could not bring their families into Japan. They could not freely travel beyond Nagasaki. They had to bow and pay tribute to the shogun in Edo when summoned. They were forbidden from promoting their religion or culture. If these trusted foreigners were treated like prisoners, imagine the fate of an ordinary traveler from another country. There was no tolerance for outsiders seeking to settle, wander, or interact with local Japanese communities. Cultural suspicion and xenophobia. Feudal Japan was built on rigid order, and anything foreign was seen as a potential disruptor. The Japanese people had a strong sense of cultural uniqueness and viewed outsiders with deep suspicion. Foreign clothes, languages, and customs marked you as different, and difference was dangerous in a society that prized conformity. Even if you somehow slipped into Japan undetected, blending in would be nearly impossible. You wouldn't speak the language, you wouldn't understand the etiquette, and your appearance would betray you instantly. Foreigners stuck out like sore thumbs, and villagers were quick to report strangers to authorities. Punishments for foreign intrusion. What if you were caught as a foreigner? The punishments were harsh and often deadly. Records from the time show that unauthorized foreigners were beheaded in public executions, crucified as a warning to others, burned alive or boiled to death in some extreme cases, deported back to their homeland in chains if they were lucky. There was no leniency for accidental visitors, such as shipwrecked sailors. Many of them were executed on the spot, though a few were forced into servitude for Japanese lords. Life as a foreign prisoner. If you managed to avoid immediate death, imprisonment awaited. Foreigners could be locked in cramped cells with little food or sunlight. They were interrogated harshly, often accused of being spies. Surviving these conditions was unlikely, especially for someone used to the comforts of modern life. Even if you were spared, you might end up in forced labor. Japan valued useful skills, so a foreign blacksmith, doctor, or shipbuilder might be enslaved rather than killed. But life would still be harsh, and you would never truly be free. Contrast with today. Today's Japan is known for its politeness, hospitality, and openness to foreign tourists. Millions travel to Tokyo, Kyoto, and Osaka every year, welcomed warmly. But the feudal Japan of the Edo period was a fortress, suspicious of anyone who didn't belong. It's hard to imagine that a country now admired for its global connections once executed strangers for simply stepping on its shores. This historical shift highlights how drastically Japan's relationship with the world has changed. Why you wouldn't last a day to survive as a foreigner in feudal Japan, you would have needed to. Conceal your identity flawlessly, nearly impossible. Speak fluent Japanese with perfect manners. Completely hide your religion or cultural customs. Avoid all contact with villagers who might report you. For most modern people, this would be unthinkable. The constant fear of discovery, the strict punishments, and the impossibility of blending in would guarantee failure. In short, you wouldn't last a day. Natural disasters and harsh climate. If warlords, famine, and samurai cruelty weren't enough, feudal Japan also presented its people with another relentless enemy, nature itself. Earthquakes, tsunamis, typhoons, fires, and floods struck with merciless regularity. For someone from the modern world, where technology softens the blows of natural disasters, you wouldn't last a day in the hostile environment of feudal Japan. Survival required endurance, community cooperation, and often sheer luck. Earthquakes. The constant shaking world. Japan sits on the Pacific Ring of Fire, a volatile zone where several tectonic plates meet. Earthquakes were not rare events. They were daily occurrences, sometimes mild tremors, sometimes catastrophic quakes. In feudal Japan, houses collapsed easily since most were wooden and built without modern reinforcements. Entire villages could be destroyed in a single quake. Landslides often followed in mountainous areas, burying farms and homes. For modern people, the lack of emergency response, no seismology warnings, and no rescue teams would mean instant death or entrapment. Tsunamis. The ocean's wrath. Where there were earthquakes, tsunamis followed. Feudal Japan's long coastline made it vulnerable to these devastating waves. A single offshore earthquake could send walls of water racing inland. Imagine, villages wiped off the map in minutes, rice fields, already scarce, flooded and ruined. Survivors left homeless, starving, and often sick from contaminated water. Unlike today, there were no sirens, evacuation drills, or elevated shelters. When people saw the sea retreat, it was already too late. Typhoons, storms without mercy. Every summer and autumn, powerful typhoons swept across the Japanese islands. In feudal times, thatched roofs blew away like paper. Ships sank, cutting off trade and food supplies. Fields flooded, leading to famine. A modern person used to storm-proof homes, emergency shelters, and instant weather alerts would be utterly defenseless against winds strong enough to tear apart entire villages. Fires, Edo's greatest fear. In feudal Japan, especially during the Edo period, fires were the deadliest urban disaster. Edo, modern Tokyo, was nicknamed the City of Fires because houses were built almost entirely of wood and paper walls. Cities were tightly packed, with narrow streets. Firefighting was primitive, mostly bucket lines and wet cloths. One careless spark from a cooking pot could ignite a firestorm that consumed hundreds of homes. Great fires swept Edo repeatedly, leaving thousands dead or homeless. For modern city dwellers, the absence of fire alarms, extinguishers, or hydrants would mean near certain death. Floods and harsh winters. Rivers often flooded after heavy rains or snowmelt, drowning crops and homes. Seasonal suffering included flooded rice paddies, famine, freezing winters without modern heating, death from exposure. Snow-blocked mountain villages cut off for months. Peasants often resorted to eating bark, grass, or whatever scraps they could find to survive. Modern people, used to warm houses and grocery stores, wouldn't endure even a season of such hardship. Disease after disasters. Every natural disaster was followed by epidemics. With dead bodies, contaminated water, and starving populations, outbreaks of smallpox, cholera, or plague spread quickly. Without medicine, a disaster's aftershocks often killed more people than the disaster itself. Disasters as weapons of war. Warlords sometimes took advantage of disasters, invading weakened villages after a storm or flood, burning rice stores when famine already spread, relocating survivors into servitude. So even if you survived the quake, fire, or flood, you might still fall prey to enemies. Lessons from nature. Despite these hardships, the people of feudal Japan developed resilience, building houses light and flexible to withstand quakes, creating rituals and shrines to appease kami, spirits, of storms, mountains, and rivers, working collectively to rebuild villages again and again. For them, survival was part of life. For us, it would be a nightmare beyond imagination. Why you wouldn't last a day. Living in feudal Japan meant constant battle against nature. An earthquake might bury you before sunrise. A tsunami might sweep away your village before lunch. A fire might burn your entire city by nightfall. And if you survived, famine and disease waited in the shadows. Without modern technology, medicine, or infrastructure, you would not endure the harsh climate and violent natural disasters of feudal Japan. For its people, these trials were normal. For you, they'd be unbearable. Spiritual fear and superstition. If you were somehow transported into feudal Japan, one of the hardest things for you to adapt to wouldn't just be the physical hardships of war, famine, or poverty. It would be the invisible world of beliefs, rituals, and superstitions that shaped everyday life. Unlike the modern age, where science and technology explain most mysteries, people in feudal Japan lived in a constant state of spiritual fear. Their worldview was dominated by gods, spirits, ghosts, demons, and religious authorities who dictated what was acceptable behavior. For a modern person used to rational explanations and personal freedom, surviving in such an atmosphere would be emotionally exhausting and socially dangerous. The world of kami and spirits. At the heart of Japanese spiritual life was Shinto, the indigenous religion of Japan. Shinto taught that the world was inhabited by countless kami, divine spirits residing in rivers, mountains, trees, rocks, and even household items. Every action, from farming to cooking, was thought to please or anger these spirits. For peasants, the success of a harvest depended on their ability to maintain good relations with local deities. Forgetting to perform a seasonal ritual or showing disrespect at a shrine could be blamed for crop failure, drought, or disease. Imagine living with the constant fear that one missed prayer or one careless action could doom your entire village. Unlike today, where bad weather is explained by climate and agriculture by science, in feudal Japan, these were matters of divine will. You couldn't simply say, "It's bad luck," and move on. You would be accused of offending the spirits. The fear of yokai and ghosts. One of the most terrifying aspects of spiritual life was the belief in yokai, supernatural creatures that haunted the land. These included kappa, water demons that could drown humans and animals; tengu, bird-like creatures known to trick or attack arrogant samurai; oni, ogre-like demons associated with disaster and punishment; yurei, restless ghosts of people who died violently or without proper burial. Every forest path, river crossing, or abandoned house was believed to be haunted. People feared traveling at night not because of bandits alone, but because of spirits lurking in the darkness. If you, as a modern person, laughed at these stories or dismissed them as myths, you'd likely be seen as arrogant or disrespectful. Worse, your disbelief might mark you as cursed or unlucky, making you a social outcast. In feudal Japan, fear of the unseen was as real as fear of the sword. Buddhism and the weight of karma. Alongside Shinto, Buddhism was a dominant spiritual force. Buddhist temples were not just places of worship, but powerful political and cultural institutions. The Buddhist worldview stressed karma and rebirth, the idea that your current suffering was the result of past life misdeeds, and that you must endure hardship to escape the cycle of suffering. This meant that if you were a starving peasant or an abused servant, complaining about your fate was dangerous. You'd be told it was the result of your own karma, and rebellion against your social role would only bring worse rebirths. For someone used to modern ideas of fairness and justice, this acceptance of suffering as destiny would feel unbearable. Rituals, omens, and daily life superstitions shaped nearly every daily decision. Certain days were considered unlucky for travel or marriage. If a black cat crossed your path, it might be seen as a sign of disaster. Cutting your nails at night was forbidden, as it invited death. The placement of a house or grave had to follow strict spiritual rules. Breaking these taboos, even accidentally, could cause neighbors to avoid you. Fear of spiritual contamination was so strong that entire families could be shunned if accused of angering the spirits. As a modern person used to freedom of choice, wearing what you like, traveling when you want, or laughing at superstitions, you'd constantly clash with the cultural expectations of feudal Japan. Religious authority and control. It's important to understand that religion in feudal Japan was not just personal, it was political. Temples and shrines held enormous power, both spiritual and economic. Villages often paid taxes directly to temples, and monks could act as judges or community leaders. Questioning religious authority was dangerous. For example, during the Tokugawa shogunate, the government enforced Buddhist temple registration to root out Christianity. Anyone suspected of following foreign religions or denying Buddhist Shinto practices could be executed. For a modern outsider who values freedom of belief, being forced to bow, pay tribute, and follow rituals you don't understand would feel suffocating. Refusal was not an option. It was a matter of survival. Festivals of fear and purification. Seasonal festivals in feudal Japan often revolved around purification and warding off evil. Fire rituals, mask dances, and offerings were meant to keep away spirits. Some were joyous, but others were terrifying. For example, villagers sometimes burned effigies or staged mock demon chases to scare away bad luck. Imagine being forced to participate in these rituals, whether or not you believed in them. Refusal would mark you as disrespectful to the gods, and in a society where harmony was valued above all, your personal disbelief would not be tolerated. Living under constant spiritual pressure. Put simply, in feudal Japan, you could never truly relax. Every act, from how you prayed to how you buried your dead, was linked to the spiritual realm. Illness, famine, natural disasters, all could be blamed on spiritual negligence. For modern people used to scientific reasoning, this constant spiritual pressure would feel unbearable. You couldn't openly doubt, you couldn't argue logic, and you couldn't separate daily life from religion. You'd be forced to follow rituals out of fear, not faith. Why you wouldn't last. The fear of spiritual contamination, the dominance of superstition, and the control of religious authority made feudal Japan a society where the unseen was as threatening as the seen. To live there, you had to believe, or at least pretend to believe, in a universe filled with spirits and gods watching your every move. As a modern individual, accustomed to rational thought, skepticism, and freedom of choice, you'd find this world oppressive and alien. Every step, every meal, every word was tied to rituals you might not undersee.